Thank you. Thought for a horrible moment there I wouldn't get a chance. I need to say, I have heard both men and women represented here today. When we look at the Constitution, I suppose we've got to consider that it is the overarching document by which the Supreme Court has to make decisions in the interpretation of legislation. So any legislation that goes through this House gets the presumption of constitutionality, but that presumption has to be tested in the court, and yesterday we saw that, and we saw a situation where a piece of it was tested and found to be wanton in its scope. So the Supreme Court has to view things through the confines of the Constitution, and in whatever way the Constitution sets out and the parameters of that set out and voted upon by the people of Ireland. So what it says is really, really important, because anything that we put through this House could ultimately be tested in the Supreme Court for its constitutionality. And I suppose we have situations like yesterday's decision where a blatant injustice is tested and articulated to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made a very, very good and comprehensive decision in that regard. But they didn't do it with the definition of family and marriage, because it's not there. They had to be creative. They had to find another route to justice. And our Supreme Court shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't have to do that. Any of us looking at that case yesterday would have said that man should have had the financial support of the state. And we still will have to legislate for him to have it. Yesterday didn't mean that he's a cent richer today. He's not. You know, and so they had to look at it through the lens of the equality of children, a recent amendment to the Constitution, and the right of a parent, or the obligations and duties of a parent. And through that relationship, not through the horizontal relationship of him to his partner of 20 years. So we've got to think about the Constitution sets the boundaries on which the Supreme Court can make decisions. And yes, they do point to where there are lacunae, where are there gaps. They'll challenge the legislature to say there is, you need to take action here and you need to fill, but they can't still, they're still confined. They don't have the latitude to speak justly to a situation if it isn't there in the Constitution. Now, what we have never had, to my knowledge, but there may well be, I will be happy to stand corrected, but what we've never had is somebody who goes on and says the corollary of yesterday's decision, that I'm married, therefore I should have this right and nobody else should, because that would be just not something that would go to the Supreme Court. But we stand at risk of something like that happening if we don't amend the Constitution. If we don't broaden the definition of family, we stand to have that elevated and the hierarchy of the institution of marriage standing and being a reason for injustice on other families. And that does happen. The state does go in and argue that particular instances in front of it are not deserving of the constitutional protections of the family, and the unenumerated rights within the Constitution require that kind of interpretation. So a family's right to privacy, they don't have it if they're not a constitutional family. So we do need to address it. We do need to ensure that the Supreme Court has that scope to include all permutations of families. And while in 1937 it was perhaps unimaginable to have families not founded on marriage, the fact is today that lots of children are born, we heard percentages yesterday, 42% are born without their parents being married. They have enduring relationships. Mr. O'Mara was in a relationship for 20 years. There is no less of a commitment. People don't necessarily feel they have to be married. in order to have committed and durable relationships. And if we look for, well, what is the indications of what we mean by durable relationships? If we look back to the Children and Family Relationships Act, we see in that there are criteria of living together for guardianship. You know, there are cohabitee circumstances. So I think there are signposts there as to what we mean by durable relationships, and it is to be obtuse to say that it can be stretched beyond possibility. And I stand as the mother of a child, and we won't, even when this comes in, we won't be considered a constitutional family. We require legislation to do that. So I think that we need to consider the consequences that flow from making this change. The first one that would strike me would be the Family Home Act of 1976 that defines the family home as a dwelling in which a married couple resides. You know, two people who buy a home together or who have a home together, or one contributes and it might be in the other's name. We need to ensure that that family home is protected, whether it's founded on marriage or not. You know, and on that note, being married doesn't guarantee you the assets out of the marriage in the situation of the dissolution of that marriage. There are many circumstances over the years, and Senator Ruan very well articulated them, but of where no maintenance is paid, where access orders aren't honoured, where there is blatant people giving up jobs. Men, I know of situations through counselling over the years, and counselling women in particular, of men who gave up their jobs so as to be assured that they wouldn't be found to have to contribute towards the mortgage. That where families found themselves, destitute due to deliberate acts of badness. They were married, didn't protect them from that at all. Didn't protect, I don't do family law because the immorality of some of the actions by people in the breakup of relationships is so horrific. I think I was briefed once and shouted at my client because I found him abhorrent. So it wasn't for me. But there are decisions that have to be made. We do need to consider the scope and amend the social welfare, amend a whole heap of things regarding pensions, access, assets, all of that. All that needs to be done. If you look at the pure definition of durability, it is able to withstand wear, pressure, hard wearing. There is a longitudinal view of it, so we can't be casual about it. We need to interpret it with sensibility. There are things there that give us all the signposts that we need for how this will be interpreted. But, we need to, any clarification from you, Minister, is useful and is good. I'm old enough, just about, she lies, to remember when the Berlin Wall came down. That's how old I am. And on the 30th of June, 1991, is a bank holiday in Hungary. It is the day the last Soviet member of the Soviet army left Hungary and went back to Russia. And it is a national holiday in Hungary. It is a national holiday because it was such a significant day in their history. And it would have been unthinkable at that time to imagine that the day would come when the Prime Minister of Hungary would block aid to Ukraine in the face of Russian hostilities on that country. It would have been unthinkable. It would have been unthinkable over the years and the progress in Poland that they would start moving against LGBT people. It would have been unthinkable that a member state of the European Union would undermine its own Supreme Court and the rule of law. All of those things between Hungary and Poland have been completely and utterly unthinkable. And we don't know what a future holds. The worst case scenario for me as a member of Fine Gael is not necessarily a Sinn Féin government. It's a right-wing government in this country. It's all of those prospects and those possibilities that come around through the manipulation of people through social media. They're unthinkable sites of arson around our country. So having a constitution that is robust, that reflects the values of our people at a time when we are inclusive, when we are generous, when we are progressive, is really important, so that the undoing of that cannot be simply done by any permutation of future government in our country. The fact that it has to go to the people to change the definition of family is really important, and that it would have to go to the people again if ever we were to take a right or an extreme left turn. So I think that this is something that we need to do. We need to do it urgently. We need to reflect family as we know it in our country. And it needs to be elastic. The durability needs to be elastic to reflect family as we know it to be, and as is the lived experience across all of our society. So I do support this, absolutely. And as regards NGOs, I don't know what sort of committees any of you sit on, Senator Mullen, but I sit on the Housing Committee. Well, too many probably for all of us. I sit on the Housing Committee and I sit on the Children's Committee, and I can tell you many an NGO is coming in and absolutely torn the government apart, because that is a democracy. In fact, we fund them to do it at times, to point out where our deficiencies are. So the idea that their loyalty and their yes vote can be bought or coerced, I find it objectionable and it's obscene, to be perfectly honest.
So if members could, thank you.
So I dispute that, and I also very much honour the agency of the NGOs in this regard. So I do, I'm nothing more to say. Everything has been said at this stage.
Thank you. No, just